Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today is a Stashin with Stephanie day where we have some fun with some fat quarters. For those of you who don't know, Stashin with Stephanie is a subscription program we have at Quilt Addicts Anonymous where we send you 12 fat quarters for the price of 10. So you already get 2 fat quarters for free. Plus we give you a $10 coupon code off a $20 purchase. So if you want to get more fabric to go along with one of the patterns that we're making, you can and save. And we give you a free pattern. And this month we are working with Alison Glass Road Trip, and so we are using almost all of the fat quarters that are in this line. So if you're not a member of the club, you can pick up a fat quarter bundle of Road Trip for Alison Glass, and that will get you everything you need for the top. You will need to get some binding beyond that. So if you're not a member of the club, you can get the pattern separately, but if you are, you get 2 free fat quarters. You can get another yard of fabric for free if you use the coupon, and you get the free pattern. So if you follow along and you take advantage of all the discounts, you end up getting 18 free yards of fabric and 12 free patterns every year. So it's pretty cool. You can start and stop at any time. Lots of fun. So let's get into today's video. All right, so the second I saw Alison Glass, I love Alison Glass. I am wearing her mariner's cloth and a tunic today with a little bit of cape for the little placket there. And I just really love her bold, saturated colors. I really, really love color, if you couldn't tell by this channel. And so I just love her use of it. And when I saw it was called Road Trip, I thought, let's do a modern trip around the world. So a trip around the world quilt, for those of you who have not done one before, you end up making a giant tube of fabric and then you slice it apart. And traditionally that all starts from the center and goes out. And so there's not much fuss with it. Now we're going to have an alternate grid setting for ours, which means that the tube section is going to get a little weird, but the layout diagrams in the pattern to go along with this, called Modern Trip Around the World, available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, along with the Road Trip fabric while it lasts, as it will show you everything you need to know and how to cut it, and this video will help you along with that as well. So my first tip is you need to arrange everything in color order. I've done that here. I've started with my yellows and gone into the greens, blue purples, and then pinks finally. And so you're going to want to number the fabrics so that way you can keep track of what is in what place. So first decide what order you want everything to go in so that it kind of is in rainbow order, and then number them all. What I did is I just took a sheet of label paper, the same kind that you would use if you were sending Christmas labels out to your family, Christmas cards out. And I just numbered 1 through 24, which is the amount of fat quarters we need for this. And then we're going to cut them apart and we're going to keep our numbers so that way we know what fabric goes in what order. So let's get started. All the cutting instructions and layout diagrams for this pattern are available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. You can download the pattern there. And if you can get it for free if you're a member of Stashin with Stephanie, or for a fee if you are not, but you can join. And then you have access to all the patterns we've ever done for Stashin with Stephanie. All right, so what I've done is I've cut everything already to the specifications in the pattern, and I've got it arranged in color order. Now you're going to have a little bit extra when you are done, and you could use this for binding. You could have a scrappy binding if you want. I think I'm actually going to use some mariner's cloth, maybe even this color that I'm wearing. I can match my quilt. That'll be fun. And what I've done is I have numbered those. I just took my little bits of labels and I just numbered the fabric so that way I've got a reference as I'm going, so that way I know what order everything is supposed to be in, and there's no question when I get to the tube part of what's supposed to be next. So that'll be really helpful as you go along. So I'm going to set this off to the side so that I have it for reference. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing these together, and we're going to create one gigantic tube. So I'm going to sew these into sets of 3 because that works out really well from a assembly perspective. Also, another reason to label your extra pieces instead of these is we're going to need to press this and trim it. And I don't want to press over adhesive and have it do weird things and then not be able to get off the fabric. That would be bad. So we'll have that and set it off to the side. So I'm gonna start sewing these together. What I like to do whenever I'm sewing strips together is sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. I know myself, I know that I sometimes get a little lazy on the long seams, and so it works better for me to sew that scant 1/4 inch seam. Then I'm more likely to be on the actual 1/4 inch seam rather than a little skinny and have it turn out not the way it should. So I've already set my sewing machine up to do that, and we're gonna start sewing. All right, so I have color 1 and color 2 together, and now it's time to add color 3 to that, and just keep on going in that manner. One other thing you want to watch for as you're sewing these together is to make sure that you keep the cut edges even, because you don't want to have these all jagged, because then you might not get enough to make all the tubes you need for this quilt. So pay attention to that. Make sure these are even as they go across, so that way you have a nice even edge to deal with when we start to cut our tubes apart. Now when it comes to assembling the rows for this quilt, it would be really challenging to get all the rows to press one direction or another so the seams can nest. So I'm just gonna avoid it all and press all the seams open instead. It'll make for a really flat seam, and then you won't lose any of the width of your strips by pressing it from one side or the other. So to do that, I flip it over, and then I just kind of open the seam with my fingertips like that. Then I'm gonna put the tip of my iron right in the center of that seam, and I'm kind of angling the iron so that way I'm not going over this seam, because I don't want to iron that to the side. I want it to be nice and straight. And I'm just kind of going down that seam. Do the same thing over here. And I find that if I take my 3 fingers and hold that down, that really helps keep that seam open before I get my iron to it. Now I always iron when I'm pressing open from the right side too, just to get it really flat. And when it really matters, I also take a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press or your favorite spray starch, give a little spritz, and that'll help it lay really, really flat. All right, I'm gonna set this to the side, and then I'm gonna start sewing my others together, again in sets of 3. So we got colors 1 through 3, next is colors 4 through 6, and so on, until we have an entire width of tubes, and then we're gonna sew them together at the very end. So start sewing into your sets of 3, join your 3s into 6, and so on, follow your pattern, and then come back once you get all those sets together, and show you how to create your tube. All right, so my tube isn't a tube yet. Right now it's in 2 halves. We have 1 half and then the second half here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flip this right sides together, line up my top rows again, and then I'm gonna sew down the sides, but I'm not gonna press because it's gonna make it easier to cut our tubes. All right, so right now I'm sewing up both sides of this so that I'm gonna have a fabric tube instead of one long straight piece. And then we can have our colors moving from one to another really easily without having to cut each square individually and have a big design wall, because that's just not always feasible. I know I don't have room for that in my sewing room. And this is so much faster. Now, if you notice I haven't pinned a thing yet, that's because I'm just strip piecing. So I can just line the edges of my strips up and go. All right, one side down. Now it's time to line up the other side to finish off our tube. So piece 1 should be by piece 24 now. All right, so now my fabric is sewn into one gigantic tube. And again, I'm not pressing the sides that I just sewed because it makes it easier to trim in the next step. All right, so you want to lay your tube with the straight edges that we kept all nice and lined up to the left. Now, you may need to do a little bit of trimming to get that edge nice and square, but if you were careful, then it should be pretty much good to go from the start. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my ruler across it, and we are cutting these across the same width as the original strips were wide. So that's the plan there. And what I'm doing is I am making sure that an inch line of the ruler is lining up with my seams as I go, because then that means I'm going to have nice right angles when I go to join all my squares later when we put this top together. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Everything is lined up where it should be. Make sure you measure twice and cut once, because if you cut this wrong, you've lost an entire tube and you need them all for this. So you would need more fat quarters if you screw this up. So you don't want to do that. So make sure you've got your measurement just right. And again, all the measurements and layout instructions are in the pattern for this. It's called Modern Trip Around the World, and it is available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. All right, now this is wider than your standard ruler, so you're gonna have to make 2 cuts. So what I do is I'll cut as far as I can, and then I just pull it toward me. After making sure that my edges are lined up, I'm gonna go ahead and line everything up again, and then just trim the rest of the way. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and keep on cutting until I've cut all of my tubes. You guys go ahead and do the same thing. I do not press these until after I have done the next bit, which is rip them apart to fit the different parts of the rows. So I just do that all at the same time. So we'll do that in just a second. So go ahead and cut the rest of your tubes so that we can get going putting this top together. All right, so I mentioned that in a regular trip around the world, you would just pick your seams in between certain numbers. So like your first one would have, say, 1 through 12. And then the next one, it would start with fabric 2 and end with fabric 1. So like in the first one, I would pick this seam, and in the second one, I would pick this seam, and then so on and so forth. And you end up getting that gradated look as the colors go out and create that trip around the world. And it's called Trip Around the World because we're doing it from these fabric tubes. And while it may seem counterintuitive to have to use a seam ripper in order to get a pattern together, it saves a ton of time, because the alternative would be cutting all of these squares individually, lining them up just perfect on a design wall, hoping you don't screw it up while you're sewing it together, and then putting it all together when it's all done. And that would take a long, long time. Whereas it took me maybe a couple of hours to get these all sewn together, trimmed, and then start picking them to get them ready for the row. So to give you an idea, we have a sit and stitch at the brick and mortar version of Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I got all of these tubes done during one of those, and then in one afternoon I was picking, and I got through most of my picking. So it's a lot faster than your traditional way of cutting them all first. So, but this is not a traditional trip around the world. We have an alternate grid, so the center is not really in the center, it's in the top left corner. So our instructions for picking are a little bit different. I have a great layout diagram that shows you exactly what's supposed to be what, and I've sort of separated it into 4 parts of the quilt. So you have rows that are in your top left and your top right, and then bottom left and bottom right. And so it tells you where it's supposed to be and where everything is supposed to go. So I recommend that you follow that along as you're picking, and that you label it, again, using those labels for mailing address labels, so that way you know where everything's supposed to be and it's easy to line everything up when you're done. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and I'm going to show you 3 different types of rows that would be picked for this, because it's not your typical trip around the world quilt. So in this one, right now I'm going to pick for the right row 11 bottom. And so I need to get to my fabric 7 to be the first one in that. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this 7 is supposed to be the first block in that row from the center out. So what I like to do when I'm picking these is, first I use an ergonomic seam ripper rather than the little one that comes with my machine. It fits real nicely in my hands, and if it has a good grip, we have these at Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Just go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So I usually start like 3 stitches in, and I pick that stitch from the back, and then I'm able to rip apart the center there. You do just want to be careful that you are just picking the seam and not the fabric. probably I don't need to teach any of you how to rip. You probably are all experts, because when you sew, you inevitably also have to rip too. So then I just keep opening it up as far as I can go, as far as those stitches will come apart, and then rip. Okay. So now I've got 7 as my first one, and now I need to count over as many are in that section of the row, and it tells me on my layout diagram. All right, so I've gotten over as many squares as I need to get to the next number that needs to be the end of that section of the row. So now I'm gonna pick that seam as well. All right, so now I picked for row 11 bottom right, and I also have picked for row 23 bottom right. So I was able to, out of one tube, get 2 of my right sections, and that is good. So the majority of the ones that you pick, you're going to be able to get 2 sections on the right side of your quilt from. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick out those extra threads and give it a press on the edges, so that way they are nice and flat since we previously pressed them open, as well as that one seam that's in the center that was currently on the fold that we never pressed in the first place. When I'm finished preparing those rows, I also put a little check mark on my layout diagram. That way I know I've done that row and I don't accidentally make a second one of them. So now I'm going to show you a second type of row that you're going to have to make if you do this pattern. So since it's on an alternate grid setting, the left side of the quilt has more blocks in it than the right side. And so the right side has fewer pieces, and so the repeat happens more frequently. So we're going to have smaller sections for the left side. So I'm looking at row 5 in the top left right now, so you can follow along with your pattern with me there. In that case, I need piece 1, 2, 3, and 4 for that section of it. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my seam first at 1. All right, so now we're going to move over 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So piece 5 then becomes the start of a second row. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the seam in between pieces 4 and 5. All right, so I picked 4, and now I've got this whole rest of the row. And in this case, I'm just gonna keep picking every 4, and that is gonna form different rows on the left side, and their layout diagram will show you exactly where they all belong. Now, a third type of row you might run into is where you need some of the tube, and then the rest you can set aside and use for scraps for a throw pillow or some other type of project that you want to create with these fabrics. Now, once you're all done, and don't worry too much if you end up ripping one seam wrong. I definitely did on mine. It's when you're ripping this many seams, you're gonna do one wrong. It's no big deal, just sew it back together and get the right one. So what I'm left with is I'm going to have in each one a longer strip for the right row and a shorter strip for the left row. And since these are mirror image, you're going to end up flipping one going in the wrong direction. So make sure you follow your pattern diagram to figure out which way that is. But I'm going to show you here for rows 5 and 6. So you can see I've got one long row, and then I've got my short ones for the left side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these out like this. And you can see how these are just starting to go. And it will form this really cool angle as the entire quilt starts to go together. And so in this case, I need to flip this around because the center is always going to have 2 of the same together. So now we've got these together, we've got 2 of the same, 2 of the same, and the fabrics are going out on the diagonal, so we know that we're going in the right direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these together using still a skate 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to go ahead and use that for the entirety of piecing this quilt, and then we're able to join our rows. I'm ironing this just a little bit differently. I'm just kind of going over a little bit with that tip of the iron. I'm not putting the whole body of the iron on. This has already been pressed open, so the seams kind of want to go that way, and that way I don't actually have to iron over the adhesive that is in here. The other thing you could do is you could just move your adhesive over one and put it right in the middle, and then you're not going to hit the iron at all, and then you can still keep everything straight as you are sewing. So since we don't have rows pressed in opposite directions, when we go to pin, you just kind of have to make sure that you're lining up your seams so that the center of the seam are right on top of the center of the seam of the piece below it. What I'm going to do is go ahead and flip these guys right sides together, and I'm just going to fold that seam back so that it's right on top, and then kind of unfold it down, making sure it's nice and in line as it goes. And once I know it's lined up, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in the right side of that seam allowance. The reason why I'm using the right side is because then I can sew along until I stop with my needle down in the right side of the seam allowance. That kind of acts as a pin, so that way you can pull this out and your seams are not going to shift on you. I'm going to go ahead and continue doing that all the way down. You also can kind of look at it from above, and when you look at it from above, they should be right on top of each other as well. All right, so I've got my rows sewn together. I'm gonna go ahead and press this open. You could press it to one side. The more I do long arming, the more I prefer a pressed open seam because it's easier for me to get into those points. So if you finish your own quilts or you really like your quilter, I know that that helps me out a lot. Now, just like when we pressed these open when they were strips, I like to always press from the other side when I am pressing seams open. I find it gets it really, really flat. And if you want, you can use some best press as well. Well, here it is. Here are two of the rows sewn together. I hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial, and for the rest of the assembly instructions, it really is just sewing rows together so you can follow your layout diagram to make sure everything gets in the right spot. I cannot stress labeling the sections of your rows. Like, it's a lifesaver, and it will help you keep everything organized. I kind of laid it all out when I was working on it so I could just pull and grab as I needed it. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, make sure you like and subscribe, and that way you can see all of our new video tutorials that come out each week from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. We have fabric for this while supplies last over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. This is Alison Glass Road Trip. We have fat quarter bundles of that, at least while I am filming this, and basically one fat quarter bundle will do this entire quilt for you. We use all but 3 of them in this pattern, so it's a really great way to use up that. You know, you see them, they look so pretty, and you're like, well, what do I do with it? Well, this is what you do with it, and it's a lot of fun. Thanks so much for following along. Make sure you head on over to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com to get the modern trip around the world pattern, and until next week, happy quilting.